Niall Stange, our friend from the Hill, joining us right now. Clearly, Niall, this is going to be, if not the most watched event of all time. It ranks up there among the top two, I would think.
I would absolutely think so, Adrienne. The projection is for a global television audience of 4 billion people for this event. Absolutely remarkable. We in the United States are one of 200 nations approximately that are televising this event live. Worth noting maybe how just extraordinary and unusual it is to have an event with that kind of global reach. And of course it has showcased so much of what the British do very well, pomp and precision and dignity, decorum, all of those things on display at that service and at the events that we're watching right now. People can have their own opinions, of course, on the monarchy or on other political elements of British life, but the pageantry of this is very impressive in its nature.
It always is, and you know, we've seen other royal events, but for this, the celebration of a woman who really was above reproach. She has a reputation of grace, of faith, of dignity, of kindness, of just being unflappable in the face of many scandals involving her children. It seems as though she could not be touched, even though it was so close to her door and sometimes under her own roof.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I mean, she did reign over a very tumultuous period, several tumultuous periods, in fact, for the British monarchy, particularly around the time that now King Charles's marriage to then Princess Diana ended, and there was all sorts of scandal around that. Obviously the death of Princess Diana, and more recently other issues, whether to do with Prince Andrew or Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. I think one of the Queen's great assets or virtues in that respect was that, firstly, she herself was very popular with the British people and the world beyond, but also she seemed to embody some traits of being dignified, self-effacing, didn't really seem to wish to do anything very much beyond be of service to the British people and to the institution that she represents. At her funeral service, it was noted that she had made that pledge when she was first crowned, and I think almost everyone would acknowledge that she delivered upon that promise.
I wish that I would have met her. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people who dream of who would you want to meet, who would you want to interview, a dream interview, and she was among them. But, you know, President Biden was among the world leaders in attendance. I read in a recent report that she reminded him of his own grandmother. And at the meeting that they had when the two of them came together, she kept offering him food, particularly crumpets, and that he obliged. And I just thought that was a very sweet story. Her grandmotherliness was certainly one way that she endeared herself to people all around the Commonwealth and all around the world.
Yes, I think so. I saw those remarks by President Biden myself, and I agree with you. It really did put very much of a human face upon this monarch who had been a feature of the cultural and historic landscape for 7 decades. And President Biden isn't alone in making that kind of observation. Former President Obama, for example, had similar observations to offer, I believe. I think that one does hear a lot of these stories about her personal warmth to people, her compassion and just interest in people, really. And obviously that is an important trait. It was an important facet of her popularity. That capacity to reach beyond the strictures of her office in order to connect with people. That was very important. It's also something, I might add, that I think might be a little bit of a challenge for King Charles. He doesn't have that history. He hasn't always displayed quite the same sureness of touch. We'll have to see how that goes.
In terms of the viewing, obviously not everyone could watch on television like this. Some people don't own televisions still in 2022. And some people would not be waiting in these long lines to be part of the audience, witnessing the procession in real time. But My co-anchor, Mitch Carr, actually just sent me a note that 125 movie theaters in the UK opened up to broadcast the funeral live for those who could not get there. When we think about events and we think about people who somehow are so popular, they just defy politics, they defy culture, they defy geography. Queen Elizabeth would be among, I would say, 1 in a billion. Do you think that even this funeral, even in light of the fact that there's this collective mourning, that this might be a reset that not just the UK needs during a turbulent time, but for many people, a reset, maybe governmental heads of state, not just here and again in London, but around the world? Or is this going to just pass like everything else seems to?
I think there's a couple of ways of answering that. And just to take your starting point about the movie theatres and so on, showing this around Britain, to me that speaks not just to a desire to provide for people who may not be able to see things on television, but also I think a desire that so many of us have around the world for common experiences and the experience of connection. There are very, very few stories, Adrienne, as you know, that really bring the world together, not just the people of the UK or the Commonwealth. This is a global event being watched around the globe. There are very few of those of any kind in this modern age where things have often become so fragmented and atomized. As far as a reset for Britain, I mean, clearly Britain is going through a turbulent time. In addition to the Queen's death, one of her last official duties was to appoint the 4th Prime Minister in a little over 6 years. There are other economic difficulties there. Queen Elizabeth did provide such continuity over that whole span of time. The first Prime Minister who served her was Winston Churchill. She met every American president bar one since Harry Truman. That continuity is now broken to some extent by her death, and the question is whether the institution of the monarchy, and of course King Charles himself, can sort of resume the good parts of that continuity while moving increasingly into a modern era that is just vastly different from the one in which Queen Elizabeth ascended to the throne.
Niall, you just mentioned her first prime minister was Winston Churchill. One of the craziest numbers that I heard was that Winston Churchill was born 100 years before the current prime minister, Elizabeth Truss. Wow. So 100 years between the births of 2 prime ministers with whom she worked, her first and her last. That longevity is incredible. But I do want to ask you something, probably somewhat personal, I don't know, but you are Northern Irish, right? You're from Northern Ireland, is that correct? Mm-hmm. So for those who don't know, Northern Ireland is the part of Ireland that remained part of the UK when the rest of Ireland broke off. And I am curious, given that she presided over the Troubles between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, how is she viewed there? Because that was some intense violence and essentially civil war, and the northern counties of Ireland decided to stay loyal to the Queen through all of that. There must be something in that monarchy that is worth clinging to, and as represented by Queen Elizabeth II.
So that was a 3-decade-long conflict that certainly characterized my childhood and teenage years and everyone who grew up there. The monarchy in Northern Ireland is divisive by its nature because you have a significant minority of the population, around 45%, who do not consider themselves British. Now, for people there who consider themselves British, she was certainly revered. I would add a point to her credit as far as the Irish peace process is concerned, which is that she did make 2 notable moves. One in 2011, going to a garden of remembrance in the Republic of Ireland that commemorated Irish freedom fighters, and the even more dramatic one the following year in 2012, where she shook the hand of a man named Martin McGuinness, a one-time commander of the guerrilla Irish Republican Army, who had subsequently become a politician and had been a key player in the peace process. That handshake itself was an enormously powerful moment, one that would have seemed inconceivable to people of my generation in the 1980s or even early 1990s. And so I do think that even people who consider themselves Irish rather than British had an admiration for her willingness to do that, just as they had an admiration for Mr. McGuinness coming from the opposite end of the spectrum to do his part in that peace process.
Well, and Niall, I think that goes to her whole reputation, right? She ruled during some of the most turbulent times in the history of the British Empire, and yet she was able to keep things calm and to try to unite people despite all of their differences. I think that goes to her character.
Yes, and it goes to her almost unique role in keeping herself out of the mud and mire of political conflict, of political back and forth. You know, one of the arguments that is advanced on behalf of having a monarchy at all is the capacity to have a head of state who thereby stands above politics. I do think that Queen Elizabeth performed that part of her role particularly well. King Charles is a somewhat more political figure, or has been prior to coming to the throne. He has said that he understands that the role of king is different to the role of prince, and he will presumably back away from those more explicit political statements. But yes, to your point, Mitch, Queen Elizabeth, very mindful of that need for a monarch to stay outside of the political back and forth, even while doing those things in the Irish peace process, or having a weekly meeting with the British Prime Minister, or certain things that touch upon politics, but do not have her pulled down into political fights.
Yeah, I was looking at the long list of dignitaries who were presumed to be in attendance or had confirmed their attendance, including Japan's Emperor and Empress making their first overseas trip since assuming the throne in 2019. Of course, there were a number of different European dignitaries. You look at Spain's leader, King Philippe there, Denmark's Queen. It's interesting to me that we have a show of dedication, a show of reverence like this. And yet, for so many, this is the most divisive time in history. So again, I think it's like we see this and we want to speak about it, but what can we take from it? Niall, what do you believe the legacy of Queen Elizabeth will be?
I think the legacy is partly her continuity and her longevity and her capacity to act as a connector between Britain's past and its present. I think she was a really important figure in that respect. I think the personal affection in which she was held quelled some of the public restlessness, particularly eventually around the time of the death of Princess Diana, though there were some shaky moments, excuse me, in and around then. It is worth saying that Queen Elizabeth reigned over a time when the unraveling of the British Empire more or less completed itself. I mean, it had been at its peak back in the 1920s, 3 decades before she was crowned. But Britain now is a very different player on the world stage, and she was able to manage that transition and reign over that transition in a very smooth and effective and relatively non-controversial way. And I think that is a very powerful legacy, and it also speaks to the biggest challenges that now face the British monarchy and the British nation, actually, writ large.
You know, Niall, and it's interesting that even in her last hours of life, she was concerned and she was involved in the passing of another baton to a new prime minister, considering all of the turbulence and controversy surrounding Boris Johnson. It's just fascinating to me that she was able to hold on and even in those last hours stay so faithful to the reputation and, as you said, connecting the past and the present. And then, before she took her last breath, ushering in the future.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's almost the stuff of sort of myth or storytelling to imagine that she ended up appointing her 15th British Prime Minister just a day or two before her death, attending to that sense of duty that we have talked about, that sense of service that was invoked by the Archbishop of Canterbury during the funeral service that we just watched. I think the Queen really did excel at those institutional moments. She was a protector of the institution of the monarchy, and a very effective one. And I think your point, Adrienne, about how she was attending to those duties in a high-profile way right up until the last days of her life is really remarkable, and is something, you know, that you are quite right to know.
That is Niall Stange. He joins us regularly from the Hill.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find News Nation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.